Hello and welcome to The Autograph with me, Susan Lindauer. This week I am joined by Susan Lindauer. She's joining us to tell us about her story from being an intelligence asset to an imprisoned whistleblower. Do join us. Susan Lindauer is a journalist, author, and anti-war activist. However, she is perhaps best known as being the first CIA asset to speak out under her own name on record regarding the specific and detailed foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks throughout the months prior to 9/11 by the CIA, and more specifically, her CIA handler, Richard Fuchs. From 1993 to 2002, she performed as a U.S. intelligence asset covering Libya and Iraq at the United Nations as a back channel on matters of anti-terrorism. In the summer of 2001, her team warned about a major terrorist attack involving airplane hijackings and a strike on the World Trade Center. Lindauer also campaigned heavily against the war in Iraq and developed a comprehensive peace framework through her back channel in the run-up to war. In Extreme Prejudice, the terrifying story of the Patriot Act and the cover-ups of 9/11 and Iraq, Lindauer shares with her readers what happened when she tried to disclose the true facts of Iraqi pre-war intelligence and the 9/11 warning to Congress and the American people. It details the nightmare of her arrest on the Patriot Act and her one-year imprisonment without trial at the notorious Carswell prison inside a Texas military base, where she was threatened with indefinite detention and forcible drugging to keep her quiet.
Procedure, these are FBI agents.
We're activists and I'm innocent. I did more to try to stop terrorism in this country than anybody else. I've done good things for this country. I worked to get the weapons inspectors back into Iraq. When everybody said it was impossible, I worked to do it. And I'm very proud, and I will very proudly stand by my achievements. I'm very proud of what I've done for this country, for the good of the security of this country.
After 5 years of indictment without a conviction or guilty plea, the Justice Department dismissed all charges 5 days before U.S. President Barack Obama's inauguration.
I learned about the 9/11 attack in April of 2001. I was summoned by my CIA handler to his office, and he said he had a message that he wanted me to deliver to the Iraqi embassy. I had functioned as a back channel to Iraq from August of 1996 onwards, right up to the war. And so I had built, with the knowledge of the Iraqi government and the CIA, I had established myself as a communication point, which was supposed to be very positive. But part of that was that when Washington had a message to deliver to Baghdad, I would be called to give it. And I was very happy to do that because I believe in dialogue. But this time, in April of 2001, I was summoned, and he said he had a message. The United States government was demanding that Iraq hand over any intelligence involving airplane hijackings and or airplane bombings and a strike on the World Trade Center. And I was supposed to give the message that if Iraq received that information and failed to deliver it through my back channel, then the United States would declare war on Iraq.
So how did your clandestine life initially begin? Because when we talk about a CIA asset, more often than enough, viewers might have the impression that you were a covert operative for the CIA. That wasn't the case.
That was not the case. I was a passionate anti-sanctions activist, and I am passionately anti-war. And so the Bill Clinton administration decided they would try to co-opt me. And they said, look, you hate sanctions, and you've been campaigning so hard against the sanctions and the war on Iraq. Why don't you try to work on something from the inside where you can establish a back channel to the Iraqi embassy, and we'll try to see if you can help. You can, for your part, you can try to work to end the sanctions, and so I had to actually go to the Libyans and to the Iraqis and to explain my position and what I wanted to do. And either of the Libyans or the Iraqis could have rejected it immediately. They had to agree, and they knowingly did so.
Susan Lindauer tried to explain to the Bush administration, initially through her second cousin, Andrew Card, who was also White House Chief of Staff, and former U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, that invading Iraq was counterproductive, would have catastrophic consequences, and above all, was unnecessary, because according to her pre-war intelligence, Iraq was willing to give the U.S. anything it asked in return for peace. The warnings fell on deaf ears in Washington, and Lindauer was accused of being an Iraqi agent.
I'd like to tell you that from the end of the Clinton administration and the very first days of the Bush administration, we began to hammer out a comprehensive peace framework with the Iraqi government. The CIA was making all sorts of outrageous demands on Iraq, and Iraq wanted the sanctions off so badly that it was willing to give the United States every single thing we demanded. Weapons inspections that would be unconditional, cooperation with anti-terrorism efforts, which included allowing the FBI to send a task force into Baghdad with authorization to conduct investigations and make arrests in Iraq of Iraqi potential citizens and guests, okay? And after 9/11, Iraq tried to give financial documents on Al-Qaeda to the United States, which the United States refused to take. Those financial documents would have allowed the United States to shut down the financial pipeline feeding terrorism around the world, okay? Whether you like terrorists or not, you have to realize that cutting off their cash would cripple their operations. And instead, the United States went after Muslim charitable donations, which is definitely not, nobody with any brains would think that Muslim charitable donations are feeding terrorism. Buying food for children in schools and hospital care and health care and social services for the poor is the best protection we have against violence, because it gives people a hope in the future, and it gives them a place in the future. But Iraq was offering us the real documents from early Al-Qaeda figures tied to Ramzi Youssef and the 1993 World Trade Center attack. This would have been profoundly valuable. This was the real stuff. And so, you know, Iraq was offering us weapons inspections, significant cooperation on the World Trade, on terrorism. Saddam had the best tracking of terrorists. The other thing that he tried to give the United States, he offered the United States preferential contracts in any reconstruction phase after sanctions in the following areas: healthcare and pharmaceuticals, hospital supplies, transportation. He offered to buy 1 million American-made automobiles every year for 10 years. He offered to make American company, it had to be non-dual use, okay? It couldn't be military uses, but any kind of equipment for factories that would allow them to restart their industries. All of that, telecommunications, was going to feature American corporations very heavily. And then there was oil. The tragedy was, and I personally visited the U.S. oil companies. I want you to know this. I personally went to Chevron, Texaco, and ExxonMobil, and Occidental. And I told them so that they would know that Iraq was not threatening to shut them out of the oil industry. Iraq had already made contracts with France and Russia.
All of this to prevent a war.
This was a year before the invasion, and the whole package was put together in the first 2 years of the Bush administration. This was not a last-minute thing. This was already well established. The democracy reforms came after 9/11, and the promise to give the financial records on Al-Qaeda came after 9/11. However, Saddam offered to allow the FBI to go into Baghdad 6 months before 9/11. And they were like, you know, that was kind of their answer. When I went in April of 2001 and threatened them with war, they said, well, why don't you send the FBI in and you can do whatever kind of investigation you need to do. And it was like Saddam had an answer for everything. And the United States was not going to allow peace to occur under any circumstances.
But at the final stages of the controversy and the conspiracy between the United States and Iraq, a lot of people were wondering why Saddam reacted the way he did. Why didn't he stand his grounds if he didn't have weapons of mass destruction?
Okay, actually, Iraq offered to allow the weapons inspectors to return to Baghdad in November of 2000. And they said they could be on the ground within 3 weeks. They said it would be a very short conversation because they were already in agreement that it could start immediately. And Colin Powell went in front of Congress and he gave a very interesting speech to Congress, and he said, oh, the conversation with the Iraqis would be on the weapons inspections would be very short. And the reason it would be short was because the Iraqi ambassador had already agreed. From November 2000 until February of 2002, the Iraqis said over and over again, yes, 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 yes. Every time we asked them for anything, the answer was automatically, absolutely, you can have that. And it was like free picking. It was like the CIA could have anything it wanted from Baghdad, but the United States would not allow peace to happen.
Accused as being an Iraqi agent, Lindauer was arrested under the Patriot Act by the FBI.
For starters, after 9/11, Israel was the only foreign government trolling to buy national security documents in Washington. Iraq didn't need them. Baghdad already had the best. They had the most devastating access in the Middle East. Powerful stuff. Israel coveted that access hungrily for what their arch-enemy in Baghdad could reveal. Because if Iraq didn't have it already, Saddam's government would know how to get it. The real treasure hunt after 9/11 was for financial or banking documents that would expose the cash network for key figures tied to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Iraqi officials boasted they had financial documents of extraordinary value that would prove a Middle Eastern connection to the Oklahoma City bombing and the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. If so, Baghdad had not overstated the value of its cash. They wanted to trade that intelligence as part of a comprehensive settlement to lift the sanctions. By the summer of 2001, back-channel talks with Iraqi diplomats in New York were far advanced under the watchful eye of the CIA. I believe that good intelligence means you have to be brutally honest, and you have to tell people where they really stand, and you have to create opportunities for solving problems. War should be a last resort if everything else fails. And in my case, Iraq was my country and my back channel, and we had already put together a superior platform that would resolve everything. And this would have been, monitored by the CIA and the FBI. Every objective that we could think to do, we'd already achieved. Every objective declared by the United States had already been won. You did not have to kill a single Iraqi child or blow up a single building in Baghdad or Basra to have everything you could possibly dream of. The economic condition of this world would have been a totally different thing, because all the countries would have been able to go into Iraq in peacetime and help rebuild the country. And they all would have been able to feed off the spoils of the oil industry in helping to rebuild the oil industry. And everyone would have profited. It would have been a very productive situation for the global economy. And here instead you see what has happened in a war situation where the oil infrastructure is destroyed. The schools and education and literacy are destroyed. Healthcare is destroyed. The Iraqi exiles have inherited the society that they created. They destroyed Iraq with sanctions, and now they have to go in and try to manage the situation, and they are failures as leaders.
And you write that, quote, almost immediately my arrest began to expose the dilemma for defendants on the Patriot Act. How is that?
Yes, I was arrested on the Patriot Act, and I had a great defense, and I wanted to go into trial and prove myself in a court of law. I was hit with secret charges. Now think of the image of the United States as I tell you this. Remember, this is the United States of America that positions itself as the great defender of human rights around the world and the great defender of liberty around the world. And under the Patriot Act, the whole system of social order is overturned. Anyone who opposes the government, who speaks against the government, can be subject to surveillance. And it is phone surveillance, internet surveillance, roving wiretaps, which means that if you're coming after me and I have lunch with a friend, the FBI has the right to turn its surveillance onto my friend, even if my friend hasn't done anything wrong. They can capture all this, they can turn surveillance on every single person that I have contact with. And there's a misconception that it only applies to terrorism and it only applies to foreigners. That is not true. It applies to all political dissidents. If you speak out about the environment or against the death penalty or for, in my own state of Maryland, they went after environmental activists and anti-war activists. But here's what happens on the Patriot Act. I was hit with secret charges, secret evidence, secret grand jury testimony. I was not allowed to know who had accused me of what crimes, what date the events allegedly occurred on, what laws I allegedly broke. I was told nothing. I was just said, they just said to me, you are an Iraqi agent. And that's all. And I said, well, what does that mean? I'm an Iraqi agent. What are you talking about? That's silly. And they were like, well, we don't have to tell you anything. And they said, in the month of October, some unspecified action occurred. Well, it turns out that in the month of October, for example, I received an English translation of a book on depleted uranium. The act of receiving the book under the Patriot Act was a felony offense that should get me 5 years in prison. Okay? Now, the total charges altogether accumulated to 25 years in prison. Okay? 25 years in prison without having the right to know what I had allegedly done or who was accusing me.
You have spent a lot of time covering Libya as well. What's the story with Libya right now? Is Gaddafi going to leave?
Gaddafi will never leave Libya. Libya is a tragedy. There is no justification for this war at all. It is obviously about oil. We know that last summer, Gaddafi began demanding that oil companies should provide compensation to the Libyan people for the sanctions that were imposed by the United Nations. And the sanctions were imposed because of the Lockerbie bombing, which it turns out Libya had nothing to do with. Libya was never involved in the Lockerbie attack. The world discovered that the United States paid witnesses $4 million apiece to testify against Libya. And even then, the case against Libya was so weak that one of the men was acquitted immediately and the other one was, Megrahi received a life sentence. But the British government, 2 years ago, when it came to light that these witnesses had been bribed by the United States government, Megrahi was released from prison. And so Gaddafi had now, once he got his man home, Gaddafi began pressuring the oil companies to provide some sort of compensation to Libya for what he had suffered under the United Nations sanctions. And if you realize that the United Nations had done to Libya what they did to Iraq, it was like the weapons inspections. Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction to hand over to the United Nations, and Libya had no ties to the Lockerbie attack. But they were both subjected to these hellacious sanctions. The Iraqis suffered 2 million deaths, and the destruction of literacy, hospital care, the whole society was torn to pieces because of these horrible United Nations sanctions. And the United Nations built a bureaucracy for itself of six-figure salaries here in New York City, where the bureaucrats were paid a fortune to manage Iraq's oil wealth, and the people starved and died while the UN fat cats got very wealthy. And the same thing happened to Libya, except Libya and Gaddafi's a pretty tough guy, pretty crafty guy. And he began to try to get the oil companies to provide kickbacks for the Libyan people. For myself, I have no regrets for what I paid to support my values. I stood up for what I love. My work gave me the greatest sense of personal satisfaction, adventures, and achievement that I could have hoped for. Knowing the consequences, I would change nothing, even if I could. These days, I'm a free agent for peace and nonviolence. I still live in Tacoma Park doing animal rescue work with my little family of dachshunds and kitty cats. My Japanese weeping cherry tree, planted the week of my arrest, still grows in my front yard, serene and undisturbed by the tumultuous times of our world. Each spring, my peace tree blossoms in white petals again, and though all of us working together failed to stop this tragic war in Iraq, in my heart I am content to know that all of us tried so hard together. As Odysseus Elitis wrote about the fight against fascism in Greece, let them stone us, let them say that we walked with our heads in the clouds. Those who have never felt, my friend, with what stone, what blood, what iron, what fire, we build, dream, and sing.
You know, after 5 years of indictment without a conviction or a guilty plea, you're free. Now, as we sit and have this conversation, why did you decide to write your book? And were you not worried?
My book is titled Extreme Prejudice, the terrifying story of the Patriot Act and the cover-ups of 9/11 in Iraq. Extreme prejudice is the intelligence vernacular for assassination. So in a very real sense, I feel that they've already assassinated me. They've already tried to kill me off, and I have survived. And now it's important for the whole world to know what they were hiding, because the whole war on terrorism is a terrible fraud. The United States did 9/11 to itself. We allowed that attack to occur. That's very offensive. And we know that Israel was the one pushing for this war in Iraq because they wanted to take out Saddam as their enemy. The United States had no grievance with Iraq. Iraq wanted to be the best friend to the United States. They looked back to the glory days before the first Gulf War.
You say best friend, others might say the puppet.
Yes.
At the end of the day.
Yes.
So,
but Saddam wanted to go back to that relationship. The United States could have had so much wealth. They were willing to give the United States so much that it would just make you sick, heart sick, to know how unnecessary this war was.